The dog noticed her before the man did. That was the thing Sergeant Faye Alderson remembered most clearly. Weeks later, when she was asked to write up her account of what happened during the night shift on November 14th. Not the shouting from the charge nurse's station, not the overhead page that crackled through the ward at 2:47 a.m., not even the moment she stepped through that door and saw him. A man built like a structural wall, pressed into the corner of the room with his back literally touching where two surfaces met, as though the geometry of the space was the only thing he still trusted. It was the dog, a black German shepherd, maybe 4 years old, sitting directly in front of the man's knees with perfect stillness. And the instant Faye pushed open the door, that dog turned its head and looked at her. Not with aggression, not with fear, but with something that she could only describe later as evaluation. Like it was making a decision. She stopped walking. She let it look. The call had come from Constance Bellamy, the charge nurse, who had the kind of voice that only existed in people who had survived long enough in the system to stop softening things. She'd caught Faye in the break room, where Faye was reheating the same cup of coffee she'd forgotten about twice already. "Room 14, Bellamy said. "Patient was transferred in from emergency 2 hours ago. Former JTF2. They're saying he won't let staff approach. He hasn't spoken since intake. The dog is a certified PTSD service animal. His paperwork is in order. I've checked it myself. But Dr. Prudhomme wants it removed before morning rounds because it, quote, creates an uncontrolled variable in the therapeutic environment." Faye had looked at her coffee. "And you're telling me this because you're the only one on this floor right now who did 2 tours before you went to nursing school." Bellamy set a file folder on the table. "And because I've already sent 2 staff members in there, and one of them is currently crying in the supply closet." The folder had his name on the tab. Warrant Officer Dale Sheridan. She crossed that out in her mind immediately. It wasn't right for this story. Corporal Niall Croft, 41 years old. Served with the Canadian Special Operations Forces for 14 years before a training accident in Petawawa that destroyed the cartilage in his left knee and, according to the notes scrawled in the margins of the triage sheet, something less visible and harder to name. Honorably discharged 8 months ago. No next of kin listed. 1 emergency contact. K9 Handler Unit. CFB Trenton. Dog, Bandit. Black GSD. Cert. No. 7742C. Not even a person. A unit. Faye had stood in the break room for a moment reading that line. Then she picked up the folder and walked to room 14. She didn't knock. Knocking, she'd learned a long time ago, was a social performance that meant nothing in certain contexts. It said I am announcing myself, but it didn't say I am safe, and those were 2 very different things. Instead, she opened the door slowly and stood in the frame, not crossing the threshold, and let him see her the same way the dog already had. Niall Croft was in the corner. He was wearing the hospital issue gown over what looked like his own gray t-shirt, and he'd pulled the visitor chair sideways and wedged it between himself and the rest of the room. He wasn't holding anything. His hands were open and resting on his knees, which Faye noted because it meant he was trying, consciously or not, to signal that he wasn't a threat. He just wasn't going anywhere. He was looking at the wall to the left of her head, not at her, the kind of not looking that took effort. The dog, Bandit, the file had said, was still watching her. Faye crouched down, not all the way, not submissively, just enough to lower her own profile. She set the folder on the floor beside her foot. "My name's Faye," she said. "I'm one of the nurses here. I'm not going to touch anything or move anything. I just wanted to introduce myself. Nothing from Croft." The dog's ears tilted slightly forward. "I worked with 2 field ambulance," Faye said, "out of Petawawa and then a rotation through Kandahar. Came home in 2017, went to nursing school the year after." The room was very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped its patient rhythm. The ventilation clicked. "Bandit," she said, not to Croft, just into the air. "That's a good name." And that was when the dog stood up, walked 3 steps toward her, and sat down again. Croft's eyes moved. They came off the wall and found her face for the first time. He didn't speak, but he was looking at her now. She stayed in the room for 40 minutes. She didn't do anything that would appear in a chart or show up as a billable intervention. She sat on the floor with her back against the doorframe and she talked, quietly, without pressure, the way you talk to someone who is deciding whether or not to trust you, which meant giving them something real and not asking for anything in return. She told him about Petawawa in January, about the particular way cold settles into a forward operating base, how it gets into the vehicle frames and stays there, and how you'd be doing something completely mundane, rolling bandages, filling out a supply requisition, and you'd hear a door bang in the wind, and your entire body would be somewhere else for 3 seconds before it came back. She told him she still checked the exits in restaurants. She told him she kept her back to the wall. She didn't tell him any of this was okay or normal or something that would get better with the right program. She just said it out loud, like it was weather, like it was simply the geography of where they both lived. Bandit had moved again by then. He was lying with his chin on Faye's knee. She hadn't asked him to. He'd just decided. Croft's hands had changed. They were no longer open and flat. He'd drawn one up and was holding his own wrist, not tightly, just holding on to something. "They want to take him," he said. It was the first thing he'd said since intake. His voice was rough from disuse and something else that wasn't just disuse. "I know," Faye said. "He's certified. I have the papers. I know that too," the doctor said. "I've read the order." She looked at Bandit, who was still on her knee, and scratched behind his ear. "I don't agree with it." Croft looked at her for a long moment. "You're a nurse. You can't disagree with the doctor's order." "I can flag it for review," Faye said. "I can document my clinical assessment. I can request a patient advocate. I can file a concern with patient relations." She paused. "I can do a lot of things before I walk out of here and let someone come in and take your dog." Another silence. The monitor down the hall kept its rhythm. "Why would you do that?" he said. She didn't answer right away. She was thinking about the honest answer versus the easy one, and she decided, because this was a man who had spent 14 years in environments where the difference between those two things could be measured in body counts, that he deserved the honest one. "Because Bandit looked at me when I came in," she said, "and he decided I was okay. And I think he's a better judge of character than most of the people on this floor." Something shifted in Croft's face then. Not a smile, it wasn't that simple, but a loosening. A small, cautious reduction in the distance between where he was and where the rest of the world was. What happened next happened slowly, the way real things do, which is nothing like how it gets described afterward. Faye went out and found Bellamy at the station and told her she was filing a clinical concern regarding the removal order. Bellamy looked at her for a long moment over the top of her reading glasses, then pulled out the relevant form and set it on the counter without a word. That was the thing about Bellamy. She said very little, but what she did said everything. Faye filed the concern. She documented Bandit's certification, the therapeutic relationship as she'd observed it, and her clinical assessment that removing the animal presented a measurable risk to the patient's psychological stability and cooperation with treatment. She cited the applicable section of the Ontario Human Rights Code regarding certified service animals. She put her name on it and submitted it through the system at 4:23 a.m. Dr. Prudhomme found her at 7:15 during shift handover. He was a man who wore his authority like a coat he'd had since medical school. Slightly too formal for the occasion, slightly ill-fitting now, but he had no intention of taking it off. He was not, in Faye's assessment, a bad doctor. He was a doctor who had learned medicine from textbooks and then practiced it in systems, and somewhere in that process had stopped distinguishing between the protocols he'd designed and the patients those protocols were supposed to serve. "I saw your concern submission," he said. "Good," Faye said. "You're a second-year nurse on a psychiatric unit. You flagged an attending physician's treatment decision at 4 in the morning. I flagged a safety concern regarding a certified service animal and a patient with documented PTSD." She kept her voice even. "That's within my scope of practice. The dog is an uncontrolled variable. With respect, doctor, Corporal Croft is the patient. The dog is his registered medical support device. Removing it without cause would be like removing someone's mobility aid because it scratches the floor." She paused. "I'm happy to have this conversation with the clinical director, if that would be helpful." Prudhomme looked at her the way people look at something they didn't see coming and aren't sure how to classify. Then he looked down at the form in his hand and she could see him calculating the complaint process, the documentation trail she'd already created, the phrase Ontario Human Rights Code sitting there in black ink with her name below it. "The animal stays for now," he said. "We'll revisit in morning rounds." He left. Faye turned back to her charting. Bellamy, at the far end of the station, was writing something with great concentration and did not look up. But she said quietly, "Well done." Morning rounds came and went. Bandit stayed. What came after was slower and less dramatic, and somehow more important for that. The kind of thing that happens when one person decides to hold a line and other people start to notice. A physiotherapist named Claudette Ng, who had done a placement at a veterans rehabilitation center in Ottawa, came to Faye that afternoon and said she'd been wanting to propose a trauma-informed care protocol for veteran patients for 6 months, but hadn't known how to start the conversation. Now she knew where to start it. A patient advocate from the 3rd floor, a quiet man named Bernard Oak, who had the unassuming manner of someone who had won a great many arguments by appearing not to be having one, came to review Croft's case independently. He sat with Croft for 2 hours. When he left, he stopped by the nursing station and handed Faye his card with a small nod, the kind that meant thank you, but more specifically meant I see what you did here. The clinical director, Dr. Marie-Claire Fontaine, called Faye into a meeting on the 3rd day. Faye went in with her documentation organized and her language precise, ready for a difficult conversation. What she got instead was a woman who had been practicing psychiatry in Northern Ontario for 22 years, who had 3 children and a wood stove and a manner of listening that made you feel like your words were landing somewhere that mattered. Dr. Fontaine read through everything Faye had submitted. She asked 3 questions, all of them specific and none of them rhetorical. Then she set the papers down and said, "This isn't the first time a concern like this has been brought to my attention. It's the first time one arrived with this level of documentation. I wanted to make sure it couldn't be ignored," Faye said. "It won't be." Fontaine laced her fingers together on the desk. "I'm going to ask you to co-chair a working group on service animal policy for inpatient psychiatric units. It won't pay extra and it will take time you don't have, but I think you should do it." Faye thought about the break room and the cold coffee and the folder with no next of kin written in it, and a dog who had looked at her and decided, "Okay," she said. Niall Croft stayed on the unit for 11 days. He was not, by the end of it, fixed. That was not a word that applied to him or to anyone who had carried what he carried, and Faye would have been suspicious of anyone who claimed otherwise. But he was talking. Not to everyone, not easily, but he was talking. He'd had 3 sessions with a psychologist named Dr. Ramsey who had the good sense to let Bandit sit in the room and the better sense to never once comment on it. On the day of discharge, Croft stopped at the nursing station. He was wearing his own clothes again. Dark jeans, a faded green CFB Trenton hoodie, and he had a bag over one shoulder and Bandit on a lead at his left side. He didn't say much. He wasn't a man who said much, but he set something on the counter, a small piece of paper, folded once. Then he walked out. Faye opened it later, in the break room, with a cup of coffee that was actually hot for once. It said, "He picked you. He's never wrong." And then below that, a phone number. And, in case it ever gets bad, I know how to listen too. She held the paper for a moment. Outside the break room window, the November sky was the color of old pewter, and the parking lot below was half empty, and someone in a green hoodie was crossing it with a black dog walking precisely at his heel, and neither of them were looking back. Faye folded the paper and put it in the pocket of her scrubs, next to her pen and her ID badge and all the small instruments of the work she'd chosen. She picked up her coffee. She went back to the floor. The monitor at Station 3 was beeping its patient rhythm. Someone needed a new IV line. Bellamy was on the phone, saying in the specific tone that meant she was not agreeing with anything but was buying time until she could fix it herself. Everything was the same as it always was, and also something had shifted, somewhere underneath, the way ground shifts in spring, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a direction that mattered. Faye clipped her badge to her collar and walked back into it.